How about being introduced by somebody whose name is Thomas Moore? That's pretty amazing. Who happens to be a judge. That's pretty cool. Thank you. And thanks all of you for taking time out. We're going to be very careful with the protocol. And one thing I know is that at 6:20, the Chicago crowd is moving right into that other room. So we'll get right to business here. Peg and Nicole have written a phenomenally interesting book. The thesis is very clear, and it's repeated, and it's empirically extraordinarily well researched. Their thesis is simple. The research behind it is complex and thoughtful. And it's that Catholic schools are more than educational institutions, they're community institutions. And their benefits extend beyond the classroom, so that when Catholic schools close, neighborhoods become more dangerous, more disorderly, and less socially cohesive. We often sometimes refer to Catholic schools at Notre Dame as sacred places serving civic purposes. Sacred places serving civic purposes. It's a book with a novel approach. We know and we have known for some years how critically important Catholic schools are as educational institutions, especially for the most disadvantaged students. We've known that empirically for some time, but this is the first time that scholars have attempted to measure empirically the effects of Catholic schools as community institutions. The book ought to be read and ought to shape education policy for years to come. And finally, the book is about Chicago and the vital role that Catholic schools play in a city where the parish has been such an important building block of communities. So let me just begin. We'll just have a conversation with the authors, and then, of course, we'll open it up to a broader conversation with you all. So, Nicole, how in the world did a well-known property case lawyer and law professor get interested in Catholic schools in Chicago?
You usually call me a real estate agent. So as you know, I've been interested in the way cities work and the way neighborhoods work. And my first book was actually a lot about Chicago and a lot about cities and neighborhoods. But I've been passionate about education reform, especially for the disadvantaged, for a very long time. And passionate in particular about Catholic schools and the role that they play as educational institutions for those kids that need them most. So that role, that passion, led me to tag along on a trip with some folks from ACE a few years ago, the Institute for Educational Initiatives and Alliance for Catholic Education. We went to a White House summit on, you were there, I think you spoke, on faith-based schools and inner city children. And the whole conference was, how can we save these schools for the kids? We're losing these critically important educational institutions. So it was a fascinating conference, but what I found most fascinating wasn't what was said on the stage, but actually what was said in the hallway, where I kept hearing this over and over again, these community activists saying when the school closes, the whole neighborhood falls apart. The school is so important to the neighborhood. And I am a property lawyer, and I think about neighborhoods, and I thought, wow, I wonder if that's true, and I wonder if we could test it. And so I came back to talk to Peg, who knows a lot more about testing things than I do. And we just started having conversations about how we might go about testing this hypothesis that I just overheard in the hallway that seemed like a pretty intuitively correct one and an important one. So that's how it started.
Well, let's pick up there, Peg. How in the world did you go about collecting data among all of these different parishes and precincts? And why did you choose Chicago?
We chose Chicago for a lot of reasons. Nicole had just finished spending a semester in Chicago, and it was a city that I grew up in Milwaukee, so that I was pretty familiar with it. We were looking for places that had a lot of Catholic schools, where the schools were very important, and where many of the schools had closed, because we were going to try to compare what happened in neighborhoods where they remained open to neighborhoods where they closed. We then spent a wonderful afternoon with Sister Paul, who's here.
Mary Paul.
Who's the superintendent. Talk
about heroes.
Yeah, another a heroine, I guess. and to try to explore her ideas about why these schools were closing. And she gave us the absolute key idea, which was that it had something to do with how enthusiastic the pastors of the churches were about the school. And that is what got us started trying to figure out what kind of characteristics about pastors we could actually measure, we could get data about, and then going about how to get that. So the first key empirical bit of information she gave us was a list of all the schools that had closed and what year they'd closed and what their addresses were.
Gotcha. You know, you're making a bold empirical claim here about a causal relationship between a Catholic school closing and neighborhood decline. How do you disaggregate those causal claims? How do you know that those neighborhoods wouldn't be just declining anyway?
Well, that's where the pastors and characteristics that are related to the pastors becomes really important, because what you look for empirically when you're making a causal claim is something that would influence the Catholic schools in staying open or closing that has nothing to do with the neighborhood itself. And because otherwise you can just say, well, the neighborhood's going downhill, therefore there's no money, there's nobody who's a Catholic living there anymore. Obviously the school is going to close. But if it doesn't, if you take all those things into account, and then you know that some of the schools that are very disadvantaged have remained open, and all of them have been struggling financially, but you see that in some there are characteristics that are related to the pastors that make them less interested in keeping those schools open as a whole. Then you can start saying, well, look, this is something causal. We can hold all this, take all of this into account. We can figure out why the school's closed, and then look at what the effects of those are. And what we found was that the pastors who had other things going on in their lives, and some of them, unfortunately, of the pastors of schools that closed had been accused of in the clergy abuse scandal, and other people living in those rectories had. Some of them were no longer in their parishes for a whole variety of reasons, such as dealing with mental illness problems or just illness problems or substance abuse problems. And so the person who was taking their place, because they were sort of leaving out of turn, was an administrator who was nominated by the bishop, and that person doesn't have any connection really with that particular parish, and even less connection with that particular school. Okay. And we found that the ones that had that set of problems, that had administrators in there, were 10 times more likely to close than those who didn't.
So on this side, it's really important. This is a great and important question. It's the hardest question. So when you run regressions, which Peg does very well, you can control for everything, right? So you can say considering everything, a neighborhood, holding race and income and poverty equal, neighborhoods where Catholic schools that lose their Catholic schools go downhill. But the economists will always say, well, that doesn't tell you anything. Because probably the neighborhood was already going downhill, you caught it midstream, and that's why the school closed. Mm-hmm. The church is just closing schools in bad neighborhoods. And what Sister Paul helped us to understand was that the church wasn't just closing schools in bad neighborhoods. Some schools were vibrant and remained open in bad neighborhoods. And what we needed to do was find this variable that could distinguish between those neighborhoods that where the school stayed open, that were equal to those neighborhoods where the school was closed. And we used these pastor variables, which it's very complex, but it convinced the economists, which is something, and enabled us to make a claim that's not just correlation, but we think causation. When a school closes, the crime goes up and social cohesion goes down.
Okay, so take us through the logic of that. Why does that occur?
Well, I am a...
That's a tough question, but...
Tough question. I'm not from Chicago, and I grew up... I'm not even a cradle Catholic. I grew up a public school kid and a Protestant. But, it is well understood, and one of the reasons that we were so attracted to Chicago and Philadelphia, which is the other city where we tested, this claim. As you know, these two cities have both been called cities of parishes. Chicago is sometimes called a city of neighborhoods, but it's also called a city of parishes. And both of these cities, people would, until not too long ago, if you ask, where do you live, you would say, I'm from St. Anne's. And so we knew from historians that the parish is this critically important neighborhood institution. We also knew that the parishes had changed a lot in the last 40 years or so. But we had a sense that institutions that had been in these neighborhoods for 100 years were probably pretty important to the institutions. We have a sense that the neighborhoods that lose these critically important institutions would start to unravel, that these schools are doing something to hold the neighborhood together, even as the neighborhood changed. There's a whole lot of literature on the importance of social cohesion to neighborhoods. There's a whole, some of you may be familiar with the broken windows hypothesis. The broken windows hypothesis is that when a community fails to be able to get little things under control, to fix a broken window or clean up the graffiti or tell the kid to pull his pants up or, to move the prostitutes along, all of these signs of disorder kind of spin into a spiral that leads to crime. And so what we started thinking about is, do we see this developmental cycle happening and being triggered by the loss of this critically important community institution, this Catholic school? It might be other institutions that are doing the same thing. So that's what we think is happening. The school is doing work that's holding the neighbors together. And when they lose that tie, then the neighborhood starts to unravel. And in a conversation that I once had with a bishop who I will not name, but is not in the Archdiocese of Chicago, I asked this bishop, who had grown up in a neighborhood not unlike one of these, well, what happens? Why are we finding this? And he shrugged and said, sometimes it's the last thing these places have. It's not surprising that everything falls apart when these neighborhoods lose their last remaining functional social asset. And that's what's happening. And it leads eventually, not surprisingly, to serious crime.
I find that the most interesting claim of the whole book, because normally one would think, I would have thought, these are actually symptoms. But what you've demonstrated is they're actually causes. That's pretty important. Let me ask you this. I grew up in Chicago. I bet a number of us here in the room grew up in Chicago, went to a Catholic school, had my Catholic parish. Catholic schools and parishes are distinctive in Chicago. What makes you think that Chicago isn't unique? Peg, maybe?
Well, we did do a similar kind of empirical work in Philadelphia, as Nicole said, and also Los Angeles. And we picked these three cities for a number of reasons. Chicago, we've already told you about. What I omitted to say before was that Chicago and the University of Chicago have done studies of the social networks in the communities in Chicago that are absolutely wonderful. They've got all kinds of great data. And I knew about that already, as did Nicole. And so once we figured out that we could get the other kinds of data that we needed on the pastors and on the schools, it became the natural place to look. I can get census data on anywhere, so that wasn't really an issue. Philadelphia had the same sort of study. It was done by a different group. It wasn't associated with the university. It's a public health database, but that asked a lot of questions about trust of neighbors and how you feel about your neighborhood and whether or not you're afraid in your neighborhood and things like that. Would you pitch in to help a neighbor and things like that, which was also sort of an intermediate variable that we could use. And what we did is we used the Notre Dame network, which you helped with sometimes, and sometimes it was Dean Newton helped, and we were able to crime data out of the police chief in Philadelphia as we had in Chicago.
Lieutenant Dwyer. Ted had approximately 75 conversations with Lieutenant Dwyer. The Chicago police were much better about giving us crime data. Lieutenant Dwyer was very resistant.
Yeah.
But they were both, I'll bet they were both Irish. So.
Right. It wasn't the Irish thing. It wasn't even the Catholic thing. It's just some people were easier to get than others. And So the crime data and the crime by locality of the crime, which is what we needed addresses for all these crimes, was part of the data hunt process. Also, figuring out what we did about the pastors required us to go through every issue of something called the Official Catholic Directory, which is a book about this thick each volume. And we went through, starting at 1976, all the way up through 2006, looking at who was moving, who was the pastor, who was living in the rectory, how many other priests there were, what the enrollment of the schools were, when the priest was ordained, whether or not the priest was a member of a religious order, for all of those years, for all the schools in Chicago, Philadelphia, and LA. So it was my floor was covered with these books for weeks and weeks and weeks, and I still remember a lot about individual parishes in Chicago and Philadelphia and LA. What we found was that Philadelphia, which is in many ways, or at least the Catholic tradition and the school tradition in Philadelphia, is very much sort of another city of immigrants. It's very much like Chicago, and we expected that we'd find the same thing, and we did. We chose Los Angeles because it was a very Catholic. It was a very big city. It's located on a coast, but it has a very different land use pattern, which Nicole can talk about better than I, and also a very different kind of Catholic and Catholic school tradition, because it was almost deliberately set up, not by the little immigrant groups that were coming in and forming parishes, but by bishops deciding, ooh, the population is really growing here. Where are we going to put the parishes, and which ones are we going to have schools? So what we expected was that LA was going to be different, and in fact it was, and we found absolutely no influence of Catholic schools in Los Angeles.
Yeah, so this is sort of a mystery to us, that Philadelphia looks the same as Chicago. That when Catholic schools, so we find two things in our book I think we should emphasize. The first, which we think is causal, is that when Catholic schools close, crime goes up and social cohesion go down. We also find that open schools are associated with much lower crime rates, but we can't, for reasons that we could talk about, which are complicated, make a causal claim there. But they're certainly associated with much lower crime rates, even controlling for demographics. So we were curious about these two cities that were one like Chicago and one different, and whether they would behave differently, and what we found is they did behave differently. Philly acts like Chicago. When a school closes, neighborhood social cohesion goes down, crime goes up. Open schools are correlated with lowered crime. In LA, we did not see any effect of Catholic schools on neighborhoods. And they haven't closed very many, they don't have as many Catholic schools, they haven't closed as many Catholic schools, so we were just testing what the effects of an open school was, the effects of having a parish with a school to having a parish without a school. We just didn't see, it wasn't bad, it was just nothing. So it's a great mystery why, and whether or not we can draw any conclusions from that. So I'm a land use person, not a real estate lawyer, like Tim Scully likes to call me. But I'm a land use person, so I'm attracted to the idea that dense urban cities like Chicago and Philadelphia need these social institutions to hold themselves together. One of the reasons I'd read a great quote from Bart Giamatti, who's a former baseball commissioner and also president of Yale, that the reason we use the word urbane as a compliment is that things urban are so hard to pull off. And so I think that might be true, that we need these neighborhoods need these institutions more when people are kind of closer together. In LA, we don't have that. But we don't really know, and we also don't know, for instance, if a city like Milwaukee, the schools would be really important, but not Phoenix. So, you know, obviously opens up a lot of questions about whether we're seeing this sort of land use pattern effect or something else. The other thing we don't know is, because LA didn't close schools, is what would happen if they did. It could be that if they lost these institutions, it'd still be a negative effect. We hope they don't close the schools so we can't find out.
Maybe we can broaden out the conversation. If you were to kind of open the pages of the Sun-Times or the Tribune in Chicago these past months, you would see headline after headline about the closure of public schools in many of these same neighborhoods. What do you hypothesize about the effects of closing public schools? And would you hypothesize that the closure of public schools in these neighborhoods, as some claim, especially the parents and the teachers' unions, I think, would make the argument that the same effect would occur?
So we can think about hypotheses, and we've talked about this, and in fact, it's something I'm interested in, is the effect of different kinds of schools on neighborhoods. So if you're from Chicago, you know there's been a big debate about whether the public school closures, particularly of neighborhood schools, is going to hurt neighborhoods, whether charter schools will serve the same function. The answer really is we don't know. It was shocking when we got started researching this how little information, empirical work has been done on schools as community institutions. That is almost none. We really think our book is really the first effort to test beyond anecdote, really, or history. So there's a lot of work on history. John McGreevy, who's at Notre Dame, has a great book on Chicago parishes and their importance as a historian. But we don't really know that much about different kinds of schools as neighborhood institutions. So are schools potentially important neighborhood institutions, regardless of their institutional form? Of course, right? Of course they are. Will the closure of public schools hurt urban neighborhoods in the same way as the closure of Catholic schools? I think in some ways that question may turn on why the closure of Catholic schools is harmful to urban neighborhoods. And we think that's because Catholic schools are very good at generating what we'll call social capital, right, these ties that bind us. If public schools do the same work, I think, yes, it could be harmful. If they don't, then we could see variation across different kinds of schools. And I'm not able to make any particular claim about the work that public schools in Chicago are doing. I think another really important question about this public school closure question is, so there's a really strong argument that a neighborhood public school is a better community institution than, say, a charter school. I don't think we know that either. My guess is a really strong school is a good neighborhood citizen. And that is regardless of whether it's a Catholic school, a charter school, or a public school. We do think there's something in the secret sauce of a Catholic school that makes them particularly good citizens. And we base that on a lot of the research that talks about why Catholic schools are good educational institutions, because they're community institutions. That's why they work as schools. And then, so your question about other kinds of schools, we just don't know. I think that this is a really fruitful area for other kinds of research because of the number of schools that are getting closed. Chicago was, 54? Philadelphia this year closed 23 public schools. There's a lot of school closures going on. Just switch gears just a little bit, and Peg might be able to comment on this too. We did test the effect of an open Catholic school and compare it on crime rates to the effect of an open charter school. There are serious limitations to the conclusions that we can draw, and we do not claim they're causal. What we found was that Catholic schools were associated with 33% less crime in a police beat, controlling for demographics. And charter schools appeared in our study to have no effect. Now, we don't know why that is. Charter schools, I suspect strong charter schools are very good neighborhood citizens. There were only 28 charter schools at the time of our study. Sometimes charter schools intentionally choose to move into bad neighborhoods because their mission is, like Catholic schools, to serve poor kids. So we weren't able to pick out that magic variable that could help us get to causation. But the correlation was strong with Catholic schools and not really anything with charter schools, at least during the time we were studying the schools.
Thank you. Let me raise a controversial subject with you all. So there are 18 states in the District of Columbia today in the United States that have this thing called parental choice, tax credits, vouchers. The state of Illinois does not happen to be one of those, not surprisingly. You make kind of an elliptical argument, but a strong argument, kind of supporting parental choice as an antidote to Catholic school closures. Is that really politically feasible?
So we say our book, and I think we think our book adds a lot of, it supports the case for parental choice. Catholic schools have been the centerpiece of the case for parental choice for a long time because of their success as educational institutions. We know that they are good at educating the kids who would be parental choice participants. So the Catholic school effect, the Andrew Greeley, James Coleman, there's all the studies that show that the kids who benefit most from a Catholic education are poor minorities. So that's always been a part of the case for parental choice. We think we are just adding new evidence, which is that it's not just the kids that benefit from these schools remaining open, because they get to go to schools that are likely to put them on the path to college and success in life, but the entire community. So we think that is strongly supportive of the expansion of parental choice, even in Illinois. Now you say, is it politically feasible? As you said, 18 states in the District of Columbia now have parental choice programs that in some way enable parents to spend public funds, directly or indirectly, to attend a school that is private or religious. And I actually litigated school choice cases as a baby lawyer and on the side of expanding parental choice. And I would never believed if you had told me when the Supreme Court decided the Zellman opinion saying that school choice was not unconstitutional, didn't violate the Establishment Clause, I would have laughed to hear that in 2014, 18 states in the District of Columbia would have parental choice. When I moved to Indiana, I wouldn't have believed that we would have the largest parental choice program in the country in my home state. It just seemed like pie in the sky stuff. So I think politically, yeah, it's possible, even in Illinois, because I think increasingly education reformers across the political spectrum have come to understand that the answer to education reform cannot focus on any one sector. We can't just fix the public schools, although we need desperately to do that. We can't just try to expand the footprint of high-performing charter schools, although we need desperately to do that. There's I think the number right now is 25,000 kids in the city of Chicago on a waiting list for a charter school. We need more high-performing charter school seats. But I think people are increasingly understanding that if we want kids to get the education that they need, we need to let the parents decide, and we need to have, as my colleague at Notre Dame, John Schoenig, likes to say, sector agnosticism. We need to have a three-sector strategy that opens the door of high-performing schools to poor kids, no matter what their institutional form. And that includes parental choice programs that allow kids to go to private schools. And I don't think that's politically unfeasible. I think it's actually going to continue to grow, surprisingly, as it has surprised me with the growth of parental choice in the last 5 years.
I suspect I can guess the answer to the question that I'd like to pose before we open it more broadly. Just a couple more questions. So instead of closing the Catholic school, isn't a solution to turn Catholic schools into charter schools in cases where, their viability is challenged?
Well, so if I can be a patriot for a moment.
For a moment.
I would say that I think it is really unfair and unjust to ask our church to choose between their religious identity and educating kids. It's really unfair to say to the church, why don't you just sacrifice your faith rather than abandoning these kids? I think it's a much more just solution to say, we're going to provide opportunities for parents to choose religious schools. So that's just as a matter of sort of basic civil rights. So I think that is something we should never lose sight of. We cannot, because of the Establishment Clause doctrine, you cannot convert a Catholic school to being a charter school. You cannot, people talk about converting Catholic schools to charter schools. You can't do that. What you have to do is close the Catholic school and find a secular operator to reopen it as a secular school. And you can try, and some bishops have reluctantly and probably necessarily done this, try to provide religious education before or after school, but it's not the same. And I don't know if we can expect our charter schools to behave the same as Catholic schools, even if they happen to be operating in old Catholic school buildings. So I don't think that's the right solution. I think some bishops have reluctantly had to come to that conclusion with respect to some of their schools, But I think the much better solution is to allow parents to choose the schools that they believe will best serve their kids' needs, including religious schools. And as a result, Catholic schools will be able to compete on a somewhat more even playing field against charter schools. Charter schools are draining kids and resources away from Catholic schools. It's no doubt. They compete with Catholic schools, and Catholic schools lose kids to charter schools. But I think an even playing field is a better solution than saying, let's every school just start looking the same.
Agreed. Understood. Peg, at this point then, I think there's been some pretty significant research on the educational effects of Catholic schools. You and Nicole have demonstrated pretty convincingly about their neighborhood effects. So what's next? What remains to be done?
My idea is to look at the effect that having a Catholic school has on parishes, and whether or not parishes are more vibrant because they have schools, whether that attracts a different group to them, instead of people old like me getting young parents with children very involved with the parish seems to me to be a really good strategy long term for the church. And I'm very patriotic about my own parish in Granger, Indiana, which has not only started a school in the last 10 years, but also has currently just ordained a priest from the parish and has 3 other seminarians from the parish. It's an incredibly dynamic and wonderful place, and I'd be interested in, if I can get data, on teasing out the connections between having the school there and having a parish that's really alive. One of the things that I noted when I went through, particularly in Philadelphia, but I wasn't paying attention in Chicago, I'm afraid, was how many of the parishes actually closed after the schools closed. It's really a large percentage of them. And I'm wondering whether or not there really is a connection there, and whether the school isn't doing just a great job for those kids, and eventually their parents are going to be supported by those kids, and the neighbors around the schools, but also for the parishes themselves.
I see a conspiratorial grin on Sister Mary Paul's face. I suspect she'll be happy to give you that data and smuggle it in somehow. If I had a nickel for every parish priest who told me that their school is draining their parish of resources, and all I want to say is, yeah, think about what that parish is going to look like in 15 years without that school, you nitwit. That's my own feeling. So, hey, now that I've kind of convicted myself, let me open this up now to others who'd like to kind of intervene with a question.